Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to another episode of Aspire. I'm Alex Prout, and today I'm joined by my esteemed co-hosts, Hugh Eastman and Gabriel Viscogliosi. And we're joined by a very special guest. And today, Gabriel is going to be taking reins on this podcast today, so I'm going to turn it over to my fearless co-host, Gabriel.
Hello, everyone. Today, we are joined by Guy Adami, trader, investor, and one of the original Fast Money 5 on CNBC's Fast Money. Over the course of his career, he's worked at some of Wall Street's most influential firms, including Goldman Sachs, and has built a reputation for bringing energy and clarity to conversations about finance. Guy also co-hosts the Risk Reversal podcast, where he and Dan Nathan analyze market headlines and trends for listeners navigating today's financial landscape. We're excited to talk with him today about the intersection of finance and masculinity, how Wall Street culture has shaped generations of men, and how men might shape it differently moving forward.
We will talk about how money and manhood are linked in cultural imagination, how Wall Street reinforces or challenges those expectations, and what messages our listeners can take away.
So we're going to jump into the episode here, but before we do, I just want to let our audience know we have a special person on today. This is one of the most authentic men that I've had the pleasure of knowing. The guy that I knew in college, because we did go to Georgetown University together, is the gentleman that you see on the screen, that you meet on the corner, that you will see at a sports field. And it's also the gentleman that reached out to me in a severe time of trouble and need in the aftermath of my daughter's assault, when it wasn't very popular to reach out to families that have been impacted by sexual violence. And I will always sort of remember that. And what I will always remember too is the way that you reached out in just a very no-nonsense, oh my gosh, how are you doing, Alex? I'm here for you, regardless of what it is that you need. But not pontificating, not taking a stance, but just being there for someone. And, you know, that is a big theme of a lot of the conversations that we have. So I'm really looking forward to this episode. So Gabriel, take us away.
Yes, so I would love to dive into some questions. So my first question is, finance is often described as an area that rewards aggression, confidence, and being stoic. And these traits are often line up with traditional masculinity. So when you first entered the financial world, how conscious were you of these parallels? And additionally, did you feel like succeeding in finance required you to embrace a particular version of being a man? And if so, how did that shape the way you worked, competed, and even carried yourself outside of the office, not just inside?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer it, but a few things first. It's obviously an honor to be here. You know, Alex is way too kind in terms of, you know, what he said about me. What I will say, though, is this. When I saw the news about Chessie and when I saw the news about the Prout family, my initial instinct was to absolutely reach out to see how he was doing. And, you know, what Alex said to me at the time was, you're one of the few people that reached out and asked how things were going. And I say that with this in mind. I am certain there were hundreds of people, if not more, that wanted to reach out. But we live in a time where people are reticent to do so or fearful to do so because they don't want to say or do the wrong thing. But sometimes just doing a thing is more important than doing nothing at all. So it doesn't make me special in any way, shape, or form. I think I just knew intuitively that sometimes you just have to reach out and let people know that you're thinking about them. And I think Alex knows this as well, It doesn't mean that other people don't care. They're just not comfortable around certain topics. And hopefully well, not hopefully, I know for a fact what you've collectively built has bridged that gap without question. So it's an honor to be here. Now, Gabriel, to your question, I started working in 1986, and Wall Street was foreign to me, but the culture was not. It was predominantly men. It felt a lot like being in the locker room of a football team, of a basketball team, for better or for worse. But that was an environment that I was comfortable in because I understood it. I will tell you that the women that did work in the industry, in many cases, in most cases, were probably more qualified, tougher than, stronger than, persevered more than their male counterparts. But I also tell you that it really required a lot more from them to move ahead. And that's just was the culture of the 1980s. Was there language used on trading desks that I'm ashamed of? I wouldn't say I'm ashamed of, but I think we evolve as people and we grow to understand that things that you thought might have been funny at the time may not have been as funny as you think. And things that you did not find offensive at the time, probably without question, was probably offensive to certain people on the desk, male and female. But I think part of being a human being is trying to evolve and trying to learn and not trying to be static in your thought process. So yeah, I was equipped, I think, under the parameters that you set forth. I think I was pretty well equipped to deal with it because in terms of mental toughness, I would stack myself up against anybody. I was going to persevere, and I knew what was required on that front. I knew I was going to be challenged. I knew there'd be things said that challenged your, and I'll use the term masculinity, but I also knew how to sort of cope with that. Now, what's changed since then? Well, obviously a lot's changed since then, and mostly for the better. I think the world, or at least the Wall Street world, has learned that, that bro culture that existed back then is a thing of the past and something that should be looked back at and learned from. I do think the playing field has been equaled without question, but there's still a long way to go. And there's always going to be that underlying whatever on the desks or on the trading desks and the offices of, again, my world, the Wall Street firms. But it has come a long way over the last almost now 40 years.
So much there, I think, resonates with me in that answer, Guy, and also the fact that I've spent, of my 38 years in finance, I've spent, 20 years of that time based in Asia Pacific, where sometimes I've been on the other side of the majority, right? And feeling a little bit like the other. And hearing you say that, I recognized all the themes that you brought up from when we both entered the industry, yet both of us were part of that majority, right? So all we had to do was slot in. We didn't have to do any thinking. And yeah, if you think about it from the other perspective, the perseverance required to just, tread water. An excellent point you made in terms of some of your sort of female colleagues or colleagues that were different than the mainstream. But I want to tie this now to a little bit of a personal topic. I, at Georgetown, maybe like you, had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. I either wanted to be a baseball player or a cook, right? Those are the two things that I was passionate about. And many of my friends at Georgetown were so fiercely guided towards finance, right? They did undergrad business degrees and were so focused on what they wanted to become. And I think, of my friend group, I'm one of the few that's still left in the financial sector, ironically. And I tie it to the fact that money was extremely tight growing up. And as a kid, I saw a lot of stress in our household, a lot of fights, and they tended to all be, in my child brain, associated with money, right? That lack of money was the cause of stress in my family. And I was fourth of 5 kids, and my job was to keep the peace in the family. My nickname at home was the Sunshine Boy by my mom. And, that title was almost like a dome that was placed over me that made me, sort of limit whatever I could feel and control what I had to project, in the family. And so I said, gosh darn it, money is never going to be a frickin' stress in my life because I don't want to relive that, with my family, right? And that's what really drove me to get into investment banking right out of college, because I didn't even know literally what investment banking was, right? But I said, why not? And it gave me the opportunity to go to Japan, which is something I wanted to do. But it's sort of, looking back on it now, I can sort of see the dysfunction inherent, or the dysfunctional influences in terms of me making critical life, decisions. And I found I've had to unwind a lot of these things through my life, right? And learn to be sort of a fuller person, a fuller man. So, want to ask you, so as you were growing up, what were the messages you were receiving when it came to sort of the definitions of money and manhood, and, how that sort of came into maybe your perception of what a successful, man was. And then, how did that thinking influence the career choices that you made?
That's a great question. So I'll tell a little story, and hopefully I won't bore you to tears, but it might be too late for that. So my father went to Fordham Prep. He went then to Fordham University, and then he went on to Fordham Law School. He was born and raised in the Bronx. My mother went to Fordham University and Fordham Law School. My parents met on the first day of law school in 1960. My mother was one of 5 women in the class. The first day of class, or orientation day, the gentleman that was running orientation in the large auditorium looked around and identified the 5 women in the class and asked the following couple of questions. Why are you here? What are you doing here? You're not going to get a law degree. You may meet your husband, but that's probably about it. Well, in the case of my mother, he was half right, because she met my father the first day. She also got a law degree, as the other 4 women did as well. So growing up for me, my parents were sort of on equal footing. They were both attorneys, so I didn't see them in the traditional roles of mother and father, if that makes any sense whatsoever. For me, they were sort of, obviously, my mom and my dad, but in terms of what Alex is talking about, they were on equal footing as well. So I never had problems in terms of sort of the male-female historical roles. You come home, your mom had dinner on the table, you came home, waited for your father to get off the train, and those types of things. It was a little bit different than at the time the norm. In terms of money, though, you're right. I mean, I think for a lot of us growing up, unless you were from some of these ultra-rich families that Alex and I met at Georgetown on a pretty regular basis, I mean, there was always, I think, that concern, right? There was always sort of that underlying angst that was there that, my God, how am I going to sort of live the lifestyle, or live a lifestyle and achieve what my parents type of did? So that was always sort of, permeating in my mind. And to this day, at 61 years old, it doesn't cease to be a stressor for me. I think it's just a deep-rooted thing. I think there's always a level of concern. And for me, that fear, or whatever word you want to use, has been a pretty great motivator to continue to sort of do the grind and to push. But it's always there. But I think what Alex is getting at is a lot of times those traditional roles and that one stressor leads to dysfunction and leads to a lot of things that children shouldn't see and be exposed to. And a lot of times it's those angry fights that are predicated or built upon the stress that financial situation brings to different families. And it's hard to get around that. I mean, the reality of the situation is that I don't think it's getting much better, because in this country, and I'm not looking to get on a soapbox here, but the chasm between the have and the have-nots has probably never been greater in the United States. And you have this ultra wealth on one side that is basically unaffected by anything. They've been pushed on this side of one side of the sine curve that nothing's really going to affect them. The price of gasoline is a punchline at a cocktail party on a Saturday night, but it's not going to change their life. On the flip side of that sine curve are people that are having to make decisions. Do I feed my family, pay my bills, pay the rent? And that's not being hyperbolic. That's just, categorically, factually true. And those stressors at the one end of the sine curve and as you move into the middle of it are sometimes stressors that lead to the situations that unfortunately we talk about, because people look for outlets for that fear, anger, angst, consternation that historically has led to behavior that most people are probably not proud of, but most people probably don't understand the root causes of.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate you talking about your childhood and how you got into finance. And I know you talked a lot about financial stress and just the idea of stress, which is something I want to go a little bit deeper into, because I know we've talked about how like competitiveness and risk taking are often like glorified in finance as like manly traits in that or in any sector. Just the idea of risk taking. But can you recall a time where when that like hyper masculine culture of risk taking and forgetting about like stress and kind of keeping on task has led you to like bad decisions in the market or in leadership in ways that maybe potentially affected people around you negatively?
Yeah, a great question. I'm sure there are many situations that occurred that I'm not even aware of, because a lot of times you do things and it's obviously has that it has effect of the people around you, but being blissfully unaware at a certain age doesn't allow you to realize that, somebody might go to home and say, and I'll use the term, what an asshole he is, talking about me. So are there those situations? Without question. But you sort of hit on something, risk-taking, that machismo that goes on, at least it went on in the late 80s, early 90s on trading desks. There are certain expressions that I will refrain from using that we used at the time. And you wanted to be that person because those people were rewarded. And remember, I started right around the time the movie Wall Street came out, and Gordon Gekko and Bud Fox and that dynamic. Now, obviously, there's some theater involved in that, but it's not too far from the realities of being on a trading desk and what went on and the dynamics that existed. If you go back and watch the movie Wall Street, the scenes on the trading desk, the women on the trading desk are basically in some sort of administrative role or, some sort of helper type of role, if I may. And the men were the ones that were predominantly the decision makers. If you remember Hal Holbrook and all those different people, they were the ones in the corner offices. So that's the way it was sort of set up. And the people that at times were the loudest, the ones that were willing to take the most risk, those were the people that unfortunately a lot of times got rewarded. And I use this expression, and it's something that people should think about. There was a period of time there was a term called a rogue trader. And you might read about it. J.P. Morgan had one. Over the last 25, 30 years, probably 8 or 9 different circumstances where networks picked it up and the Wall Street Journal picked it up. And what I'll say is the only difference between a rogue trader and a partner is the P&L. And what does that mean? It means a rogue trader is basically the guy, and I'm saying guy because it's predominantly men. Rogue trader is one that lost money on a trade, and the partner is the one that made money. But they're the same person. It's the same set of skills. It's the same set of underlying characteristics. The only difference is, again, the P&L. But that's the way our world was set up. And it didn't force you to, because I don't think you were forced to do anything, but you were encouraged to be that person. And those people were, at times, handsomely rewarded. So it's hard to not be that person, and it's hard not to sort of betray at times what's right and wrong, and those lines become blurred, at least become blurred on the hours that you're working. Now, unfortunately for me, the hours that are working were Sunday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the markets in Australia open and up until Friday when the markets in New York closed. So for me, it was a 24/7 thing, basically 6 days-ish a week. And I'm not saying that to complain. I mean, that was just the nature of the business I was in. I was a commodities trader. But I think you understand what I'm saying. So there's a reinforcement of that type of behavior. Now, things have gotten better without question, but those are the types of things that you were navigating. And it's one thing to navigate it at 61 years old with being able to look back and have history and understanding. It's entirely different to do it at 23, 24, 25 when you're relatively new and you don't know the difference. I mean, this is what you've been exposed to. So you think that's just sort of the norm.
Thank you so much for that, Guy. And obviously you're in the trading sector where you're at Goldman Sachs and you've kind of had to be in this really fast-paced environment. But obviously the financial industry, it's such a big industry with so many different jobs, private equity, investment banking, being a trader. So would you say you've seen more growth in trading jobs with kind of shifting towards more aspirational masculinity, and some jobs have kind of been still stuck in that old traditional kind of socially constructed version of masculinity? Or have you seen more of a shift across all of these different jobs, or has it been kind of focused towards one?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate that, Gabriel. So listen, I can't speak with great knowledge here, but I know enough to be dangerous. And obviously, there's still shops out there that are predominantly men. The bro culture is without question embraced and encouraged. I mean, that absolutely goes on. And I will tell you, it's probably going to go on for the foreseeable future, because as much as we think we've evolved, we probably haven't evolved as much as we'd like to think that we have across a myriad of different topics. So they're definitely out there, but it's a lot less than it used to be. And I think what I've learned, having not worked on a trading desk now for quite some time, but being exposed to and knowing a lot of people on them, things have changed, and they've changed for the better. And I think Wall Street, and I'm using the term broadly because it is a broad term, has sort of understood that. And if you look across the spectrum now, the two biggest exchanges in New York, the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, are both run by women. Jane Fraser is the CEO of Citibank. Mary Erdos, a Georgetown grad, by the way, wasn't one of our classmates. I think she was a year ahead of us or behind us, but she's probably in line to run JP Morgan at some point. So Sally Krawcheck was a trailblazer. Sally's our age. She went to the University of North Carolina. She obviously achieved things as a woman in a time when nobody was doing what she was doing. So things have clearly gotten better. I happen to think, and I don't have any knowledge of this, but it's just my instincts, I think the next CEO of Goldman Sachs might be a woman. Her name is Erica Leslie. I think she's in line for it. So there's a lot of good coming out, and I think the playing field has definitely tilted the right way. I think the playing field is still tilted, but not nearly to the extent that it was. And, the bro-y stuff that was funny at the time, listen, it's always going to have a place in Wall Street, for the better, for worse. And at a certain level, there's nothing wrong with it. But in the movie Spinal Tap, this one goes to 11. You don't need 11 bro culture. I mean, 3, 4 maybe, but you certainly don't need the 11 that was everyday de rigueur in the 1980s.
So, it's interesting, Guy, if I look at how our industry has evolved, when there have been mishaps, when there's been extreme volatility, we've seen regulations evolve and change, right? And that sort of set the guardrails for the industry in terms of continuing to, literally at times exist. But when it comes to, the personalities, the way that we think and behave, evolution becomes a trickier, topic, right? And it's been interesting. We've seen some ebbs and flows over the last, decade, right? When it comes to acknowledging the existence of other people and their views, and actually the research-driven performance analytics, the benefits of diversification in your workforce. And that diversification is diversification with a small d in all the meanings, right? In terms of neurodiversity, diversity of thoughts and ways of thinking, as well as the more normal ways that we think of diversification. So when it comes to people, it really becomes a leadership issue in my mind. And, I've been doing this a long time. And one thing that I always tell my team members is, a leader is someone that people want to follow, not someone that is punching someone in the head. And a leader has this sort of mantle of responsibility where you need to think that people are watching you at every single moment, right? Because they are. And they are looking to interpret every little thing that you do. And obviously, post my daughter's sexual assault and everything that I've learned from that, I've had to evolve as a human being in terms of, in order to exist and be a good dad, I had to learn to get in touch and accept vulnerability, right? Because otherwise I would have crashed and burned. So, vulnerability was something that I've slowly learned is actually a superpower when it comes to work and connecting with your team members and getting everyone on the same page, but creating an atmosphere where everyone feels safe to be the best version of who they are. Can you tell me if you've had any similar experiences in your leadership journey? Because you are a very visible icon in the financial sector. Can you talk to me a little bit about where vulnerability has been built in your journey?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I might be visible, but I'm not a leader. So number one, visibility and leadership are not, do not go hand in hand. Sometimes they're mutually exclusive, but I appreciate that. And your point about diversification, remember this, at the end of the day, Wall Street is a place that is looking to have an edge. And I think they've learned, and I use the term they, that diversification, as Alex was just saying, actually leads to better results. And there are empirical studies that absolutely show that. So they're doing it because it's the right thing to do. They're also doing it because it's a more profitable thing to do. So put those things together, and it's a foregone conclusion that they're going to go down that route. In terms of vulnerability, being the oldest of five, birth order goes, I think it really shapes you. And, when you're the oldest, or you tend to think you're Atlas and you put the weight of the world on your shoulders and you carry it around with you. So you don't want to necessarily show vulnerability, because if you show that, it might scare your siblings or your kids or whomever it may be. So you want to be sort of that pillar of whatever. But to Alex's point, sometimes showing vulnerability shows people that it's okay to be scared of things, and we all go through the same thing. The one thing I have learned, and I don't know if I can give you something anecdotal, but what I will tell you is, and I've learned this both the hard way and the easy way, everybody you meet is dealing with something, without question. I don't care how much money they have or they don't have. Everybody is dealing with something, and the problems tend to be similar, and they cross a wide spectrum of different things. But don't just assume that because he or she is in this house or has this job or drives that car that they have it all figured out. Nobody has it all figured out. And when you sort of think about things through that lens, I think it's a lot easier to become vulnerable and understand the vulnerabilities of other, and understand that we're all sort of walking down this road, maybe not on parallel paths, but, in sine curve paths, and we're all going to intersect at some point. And, there have been times where, I remember telling my wife at one point very early on in our marriage that, I think it was like a Saturday morning. So I was actually off from work and we were laying in bed, and I started crying because I didn't think I could handle the pressures around the job that I was currently in. And I was really scared that I wasn't going to make it. And that's not typically me. And, there's certain things in life that you can remember like it was yesterday. And that's one of those things I remember like it was yesterday. And for me, it was sort of I don't know if it was a galvanizing, or it definitely, it helped me to be able to sort of voice that, and it helped me get through difficult times. So yeah, I think being vulnerable is really important. And I think allowing other people to see your vulnerability is more important, because then it allows people to realize, hey, wait a second, it's just not me that's going through this. There's somebody that I respect. And I'm saying this about me, understanding that there's a level of hubris around that comment. I don't intend it to be at all, but people assume that because you're on television, there's something special about you. There's nothing special about me, as I'm sure the last 40 minutes your audience has figured out. But if one person can take away that, there's somebody that doesn't have it figured out and is vulnerable, then it allows them to sort of say, hey, maybe I'm not an outlier here.
I appreciate your messages about vulnerability because I feel like that's just not really stressed enough anywhere. I mean, not even just finance, going past that. I feel like Gabriel and I were talking about, we hadn't been exposed to like the concept of vulnerability, and like people feel all these pressures, like you said, from your own family, like being the oldest child, and like especially as a man, like not even being able to be vulnerable or comfortable in that setting, can be constricting. But yeah, and kind of shifting gears a bit, actually, we've had episodes about like failure, and you shared a story of vulnerability with your wife, and how you almost thought that you wouldn't really like quote unquote live up to or be able to handle the stress of your own job. Going back to failure, like a lot of what we've talked about is men sometimes get caught up in the idea of like their worth is measured by financial success or like monetary gain. And there's so many messages out there in the media as well, like classic movies like you talked about, like Wolf of Wall Street, Scarface. Like, do you have a story from your own life where you might have maybe fallen into that trap, of money equals success? And how did you navigate that? And what would you say to people kind of in a similar situation?
Yeah, great question. That whole notion that money equals success. So go back to college now. I grew up in a town called Croton-on-the-Hudson, as I may or may not have mentioned. Very small town, working class town. Got to Georgetown University in the middle of August, and then get exposed to people that went to places like Exeter and Choate and had blue blazers and had diners clubs cards and things that I'd never seen before and never heard of before. And all of a sudden you're starting to compare yourself to these people, and through that one specific lens, there's no comparison whatsoever. So you start to measure yourself, at least for me, at 18, 19 years old, and that's a losing game without question. So a couple things happen. You become very impressed by it. You aspire towards it, and you sort of try to put yourself in a position where you can pretend to be part of it. But what I'll tell people is what you realize, at least what I realized pretty quickly, is that pretending, you can last for a week, a month, couple months, but it's unsustainable. I mean, you are what you are at the end of the day. So if you're going to try to play that game, that's a race you're never going to finish because it's just a loser's game. So as much as I did it for a period of time, sort of equate wealth with success, my roommate, Kevin Joseph, it was our junior year in college. It was around Christmas time before we were going home. And we lived, Alex will remember, we lived in a place called Village A. So it was some random Thursday night, and we were all sitting down together. We were all happened to be, and the four of us were together in the apartment, and It's a Wonderful Life came on. I had never seen the movie before, believe it or not. And you become riveted pretty quickly. It takes a minute or so to sort of figure out what's going on. But at the end of the movie, Jimmy Stewart's standing there with his wife, and he has this little book, and there's an inscription, and it says, no man is a failure that has friends. And that's, to me, you want to sort of measure yourself. It's not the size of your checkbook or your wallet. It's the impact you have on people around you and the friendships that you built and the way you make people feel. People remember how you made them feel more than they remember what you bought them, so that's the important stuff for me. So, I got around that, and the movie probably helped, but I got around that pretty quickly.
I've got to jump in there, Guy, on that one, because I almost burst into tears when you brought up It's a Wonderful Life, because I'm just thinking now of how many thousands, tens of thousands of men were watching that film and could connect with the main character, right? Feeling like they've messed up, they've failed, they haven't been financially successful. And, you know, if it brings a visceral reaction in me and it stuck, you know, in your head, you know, this is a theme that impacts so many millions of men, where our identity is tied to something that has no meaning when we reach the later part of our lives, right? And it's something that, you know, like I wish I could rewind the clock, right? I wish I had whatever the name of the angel was, the drunk Gabriel, you know, to sort of take me, you know, back in time and sort of see that, so I could have been a better dad to my kids when we went through our family crisis, that I could have been a better man to my wife, you know, during all of that. I realized my shortfalls because of that, you know, stress moment, and I've been working every second since to sort of carry on. But it becomes like, you know, this tropey message of an old guy saying, you know, learn your lesson sooner, right? Because life can be so much better, right? If you realize truly what are the important things. And yeah, I look back to my friendships from, you know, Georgetown and think about the reality of the conversations we used to have. It was a beautiful thing, but then, you know, somehow life got in the way, right? And, you know, changed everything. But sorry, I had to interlope.
No, listen, I mean,
comment.
it's a powerful movie because, well, I'm getting a little off topic here, but I think it's important. And I don't know if the boys have seen it, and I'm sure some of the people in the audience, most of them have seen it, but the movie was filmed right after World War II. Jimmy Stewart was in World War II, and he came back clearly with PTSD. And if you watch it closely, he's not acting in a lot of those scenes. And he's obviously under the stressors of not living up to, you know, what he thought he was going to be as a child, his aspirations, the things he needed to do. He allowed his brother to, you know, to go off and be this big star football player. And then his brother got all the accolades, and he's stuck in this small town and he can't make ends meet. And he takes it out on his kids and he takes it out on his wife. He goes to the local bar to have a few drinks, gets into an altercation. This isn't that far from reality. And it's not that he was a bad person. He was under tremendous stressors that we were talking about before. In his life, it was in the form of, you know, not living up to his expectations, one, and not being able to sort of support his family, at least the way he thought he needed to do. And then he realizes that, hey, wait a second, you know, maybe the impact that I've had on others, you know, maybe it was a wonderful life after all. And and there are a couple scenes where I absolutely, regardless of the time of year, there are a couple scenes that I guarantee you I will be sitting on some seat in the house and I will be crying watching it because it has that kind of impact. So, but it's not that far from the realities that a lot of people are facing.
Yeah, and I think those things just resonate with so many people, especially me, because I think that also the idea of ambition and failure also goes hand in hand, because when they fail and when they're not really able to kind of achieve those goals, then all they want to do is just kind of chase that thing and that goal, or whatever, it's finance or some monetary value. And I think often, and I've seen it in some people, and when they just chase that goal, and I think it's good to be ambitious. I would consider myself a pretty ambitious person myself, but I think I always try to make sure that I really keep the line pretty clear of the distinction between using kind of ambition as fuel and ambition as the only thing a part of my identity, because I think when that's the only part of your identity, you forget about, let's say, family, and as in It's the Wonderful Life, the movie, that's what happens. Family gets ignored and it gets released on other things, all these emotions. And I would ask, because I think in finance especially, often there's not a lot of work-life balance, and I think you're kind of all focused completely on your job, so that becomes kind of an ever-consuming thing, and then you lose sight of other things in your life. So I would wonder if you've kind of seen people, or maybe even yourself, kind of start to go down that path of it being the only thing you focus on, and then losing sight of other things and maybe reeling back from it, or maybe someone else just kind of completely spiraling out, and how you intervened or can make a change?
Another great question. So I think ambition is extraordinarily important. I don't think it's a bad word. I'm not suggesting you're saying it's a bad word. I think ambition at the expense of others is a bad thing. You shouldn't be stepping over people to get where you want. You should be carrying people with you to get where you want. That's me, and it might sound glib, but I actually absolutely believe it. What I'll tell you is, and you don't know this yet, Alex probably knows it very well, and I know it very well too. Some of the most miserable people I know, and when I say miserable, not miserable human beings, but just unhappy people, are some of the wealthiest people I know. Because in order to achieve what they thought was the brass ring or the ultimate goal, they probably did things in their life that they're not proud of. And now here they are, a lot of them with more money they could spend in 3, 4, 5 lifetimes, but they don't necessarily have anybody to share it with, or they don't know really who to share it with because they've alienated everybody around them. And, a lot of these people, unfortunately, are living really, somber lives. And I don't say that's the norm, but I believe me, I know a handful of those people. The flip side of the coin is there are other people that have done extraordinarily well and have shared their success with others. I think that's the type of person you want to be. And it doesn't mean writing people checks. It's just bringing people along for the ride that you've been fortunate to have. And when I say fortunate, that doesn't mean lucky. Fortunate because you've earned it. And, if you can bring people with you, that's an amazing thing. I know a lot of those people as well, and they're some of the happiest people that I know. So it's all the decisions you make on the road to getting to a similar goal, and that you can get to the same goal and have completely different outcomes based on the way the interpretation of the word ambition and what it truly means and what it means to, bring people along with you and to, lift people up instead of holding people down.
Thank you, Guy. And just going back to the idea of ambition and also shifting a little bit from finance, we know that you competed in the Ironman race in New York City in 2012.
Well, don't say competed because that suggests that I was trying to win something. So I was a participant.
Completed. Well, still, one of the most grueling races and endurance tests and physical feats that, one can achieve. Kind of related to that, like preparing for an Ironman requires a lot of discipline, discomfort, willingness to push past the point where most people would stop. And, when we talk about aspirational masculinity, we talk a lot about it, like embracing your own emotions and, knowing when to stop. But how did you almost balance those two when competing for that race? Because it's almost contradictory in the way that you do have to push past your own mind, as well as, taking the time to think and recover.
Yeah. Mental toughness to me is not a male-female thing. I think a lot of people just assume that men are mentally tough and women are not. That's categorically false. So, I'm well aware that in many cases, the women that I know, or, I can speak just my family alone, are far mentally tougher than I am. So for me, mental toughness was a big part of it. In terms of preparation, as much as it is a physical thing, it is a mental thing. And, we're getting into the macho stuff and, you can sort of, jock your way out of it. But the reality of the situation, you sort of leave the macho at the door and, you sort of embrace understanding what it requires to train. I had to lose weight before I could actually start training in earnest. And it's just, being smart about things. But if you think about what's inherent in the question is, as many people say, well, that's a really badass macho thing to do. Macho really has nothing to do with it. It's more a mental task. And what you realize, as much as it is physical, it's equally mental. And then when you sort of take that and sort of shift it across all the different things that you're dealing with, you realize the mind's a very powerful thing. So if you can somehow harness that and then spread it across your life professionally, relationship-wise with your family, relationship-wise with your friends, then it becomes a pretty powerful thing. So for me, that experience, as cool as it was, it just reinforced something that I knew, but I had never tapped into, that the mental toughness, the mental fortitude is a vital thing in life. Perseverance is really important. And then when you can sort of realize that, I think you can spread it across a number of different verticals that you're dealing with in everyday life.
So, Guy, I was at a boarding school in Western New Jersey last year, and it was an interesting experience giving a keynote, to the students there, because it was different from the schools that we typically visit around, the country. It was a very well-to-do, well-endowed school, very privileged student set. And the students had very different aspirations. So what was interesting was I had probably the longest line of young men wanting to talk to me afterwards. And the issue or the topic they wanted to talk about was, how do you be a good man in the financial sector? And I found that to be an interesting question because, they saw through my bio that I'd been in finance and held some senior positions, et cetera, et cetera. So they all were, very sort of attracted to that. And then they heard Chelsea's stories and my challenges of how to become a better man during, that journey. And they all had this firm association that they had to develop this persona in order to be successful in the industry. And they found that, it was beautiful because they were all sensitive enough to know that was in conflict with who they were inherently, as people, right? And I find in this day and age, right, we're in 2025, where there is so much data about, productive, efficient, profitable organizations and about leadership in terms of empathy is one of the key buzzwords now around, sort of leadership traits. How do we bring these kind of conversations? Because I think a lot of the evolution needs to happen from the top, especially in our industry. So how do we bring these conversations into, whether it's the C-suites or management suites to talk about, we're talking in financial terms about, unlocking, full productivity and potential. But the nice sort of side benefit is we're building safer and healthier, communities within the workplace. If we have to talk about a call to action, right, from, our perches that we have now, right, you from this unique perch in terms of the intersection of finance and media, and myself from a position in just in pure finance, what are some of the things that you think we can do?
There's this math problem, and you're probably familiar with it. And this will hopefully answer your question, but I will answer your question. I can give you $2 million today, or I can give you a penny today, and I will double it each day for 31 days. And most people say, give me the 2 million, 3 million, and I'm done. But the reality is, the right answer is you take a penny and you double it each day. And what's the point? The compounding effect in our world is extraordinary. And it's the same thing with the organization. I have the right to. The compounding effect is what you want to sort of work towards. You have to understand that it's going to start really small and it's very daunting. And you'd be like, there's no way I'm going to get to my end goal starting with a penny. But the reality is you're going to get there because of the power of compounding. And in this case, compounding is just getting the word out, whether it's podcasts like this, talking to students in different schools, having small events. There's a laundry list of things that can be done. And there was a commercial when we were kids. I think it was Clairol Herbal Essence, the shampoo. But, they told two friends and they told two friends and so on and so on. And on the screen, it went from 2 people to like 64 people in a couple of different seconds. And that's true, especially with virality these days in terms of how things get out. So you can't be on a day-to-day basis. There would be days like this is daunting. There's no way. But the reality is each day you're growing and you're working towards something. And what I'll tell you is, and what you've probably learned you can't believe how far you've come over the years. But more importantly than that, 5 years from now, you're going to be at a gala that we have somewhere, and you're going to be sitting back at the end of the night, and you're going to turn to your wife and your daughters, and you're going to turn to some of your friends, and you're going to say, I can't believe how far we've come. That is as guaranteed. I don't make a lot of guarantees. I will make you that guarantee. And that's just from the perseverance and tenacity and the stick-to-itiveness and the consistency of what you're all doing every single day. So I have no concern whatsoever that it's gonna get where you want it to be. It's just each day sort of taking those steps that you never see the finish line and there is no finish line, but you never see the finish line until it's all of a sudden like, wow. And then looking back, you say, think about what we started with and think about where we are now. And then more importantly, think about all the lives that and I'm going to use the word saved. And I think that's the right word.
Thank you so much for that, Guy. And I think so many people, especially younger people, don't really feel like they can start, but I think it just reinforces that, just like that small step taken, and then it'll just continue to compound and just continue to go on. So I would say I just have one more question, just kind of to wrap it up, so that we can really give one last message to the audience, because thank you so much for your time. But I would say, if you could leave one piece of advice for young men about manhood and self-worth, and finance as well, but kind of just as just overall self-worth, what would it be, and why did you choose that message, and why does that still matter to you today?
It's the things that you do when nobody's watching that's important. So, be the person that your parents would be proud of, that your spouse would be proud of, that your friends would be proud of, that people watching would be. I'd love to not be that person, but I'd love to sort of be the type of person that he or she is. It's pretty. If you think about life, it's not all that complicated. Try to treat people the way that you want to be treated yourself. And there's nobody better than you. There's nobody under you. We're just all people trying to get through it. So, just be kind. It's just so dumb in its simplicity. But it's true. I'll say this and you can edit it out. Don't be an asshole.
Well, Guy, thank you so much for joining us. It's funny because we've had conversations about, Alex has obviously worked in finance for, I think he said 38 years. And we've had some conversations about his stories in that sector, and, how these ideas of masculinity and gender subtly is kind of in those fields and is just inherent. But I feel like we've never had a conversation of this much depth, and from someone with so much experience in this field and such a respected figure. I think it's just been great having you here. We really appreciate your time, Guy, and just thank you so much for everything.
You're a gentleman, Hugh, Gabriel, Alex. I've enjoyed this, and again, it's a great conversation. It's an important conversation. It's one that I'm happy you asked me to sort of endeavor with you.
Well, there is such power of compounding, as you said. We refer to it in our org as someone who might feel insignificant, dropping a little pebble into a pool of still water. And those ripples just continue on, and you don't even know the impact, that you're making. But if you're lucky, eventually you feel the reverberations, right? And I do think the messaging you heard today will continue to reverberate with our audiences. And I can tell you right now, as a data survivor who's been through some horrible, traumatic things as a family, I can say today it's a wonderful life. It's a wonderful life because of the connection that I've made with my two co-hosts, with Ben, our fearless producer, and from an old friend from Georgetown that reached out in a time of need and has become a much dearer friend. And for full disclosure, Guy is a board member of I Have the Right To. And we are so grateful for that power of connection. So if I can leave a final message to our audience, connect, take risks, be vulnerable. The things that you're going to get back are going to be mini miracles. If you're feeling lonely right now, if you're feeling like no one understands what you're going through, take a chance. There are people out there that love you, that will be there for you, will stand with you, will just, provide that community that you're starving for. But that won't happen on its own. And if you take those risks, miracles will happen. So on that note, thank you, Guy, for joining us. This is another episode of Aspire. And until we meet again, we love you. Take care. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.